Shalom, friends. It's a delight to be here with Rabbanit Cohen Farber, who is the founder of Hadran, whose mission is to advance Talmud study for all women. She is also the founder and teacher of Daf Yomi for women, the first women's online shiur on Daf Yomi. Michelle spearheaded the first international Siyum HaShas for women. Rabbanit Michelle and her husband Seth founded and lead Kehillat Netivot in Ra'anana, where they live with their 5 children. Thank you so much for taking this time to talk.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So I, like so many, have been in awe and been a big fan of the amazing work you're doing. And I'd love to learn for you personally, how has learning Daf Yomi affected your life? And how have you heard from others that it's affected the lives of women who learn with you for the first time?
That's a good question because it actually is 2 very different questions. I'll start with a little bit how it affected my life. I started teaching Daf Yomi 9 years ago, started in my dining room around the table. When I decided to teach, I started looking online to see how do people teach a Daf Yomi shiur. I've been teaching Gemara for many, many years, but never Daf Yomi. And I saw that there were no women teaching Daf Yomi online. You can find hundreds of podcasts by men and not a single one by a woman, which made me realize that I needed to do a podcast also. So anyway, it started on my dining room table. So the first way it affected my life was every day my house needed to be in order. My kids knew that if they didn't go on time to school, they'd be walking down the steps and into the big living room with lots of women learning Daf Yomi, and the shiur was recorded, so they had to be super quiet. So yes, it impeded on my everyday life with my family, but I think it was interesting for them to grow up knowing that every single day there was a shiur going on in their dining room. Vacations could be challenging. If you have to teach Daf Yomi every day, it's not so simple. In fact, we went away, my husband and I, a few weeks ago, and people were laughing at me because I scheduled the days that we were going to go based on when I knew the dapim were easy and I could easily record them in advance without spending too much time preparing and teaching. But in terms of, I guess, a more deeper way of Daf Yomi affecting my life, which is, I assume, more where you wanted the question to go, is that when you're learning Daf Yomi, and I'm particularly immersed in it between the hours I spend preparing and the hours I spend teaching on a daily basis, it becomes a part of your life, and everything you see, you end up seeing through the prism of Daf Yomi. And I'll give you a extreme example from last week. After the disaster in Meron, it was fascinating because the daf was all talking about this. There's a famous Mishnah about that the Kohanim, in order to get a job, they would have to run up the ramp, and whoever got there first would win. And originally the rabbis thought, oh, who's really going to want this job? It wasn't the most interesting job. It was taking the ashes and moving them into a pile next to the altar. And it's not the most interesting job. And you have to do it super early in the morning. So who's going to want to wake up super early in the morning? But of course, the Kohanim really wanted the job. So they start running up the ramp, and one knocks the other one over and breaks his leg. And a much more worse version of the story, they are running up the ramp and one guy wins and the other Cohen decides to stab him. And to teach this right in the wake of that horrible stampede that had happened there. And what's fascinating about the story is the rabbis then say they immediately realized that there's a problem here, and they instituted a lottery system. And all I can think about is that's what has to be done here, that you have to fix, there's a problem and it has to be fixed. And there were all these issues about leaders and leadership and what makes a leader a good leader, and that you have to find the fine balance between humility and also, though, putting your foot down when you believe in something. And when you learn those texts and there's things going on around you, it just becomes a part of your life, and you see everything through the prism of the daf. And what teaching the daf every day is quite a challenge. And I have to say, it's probably, one of the biggest challenges I have right now, but it's also something and here I want to segue into the question about other women, where there is a parallel between myself and other women. It's number one, the relevance, and number two, the fact that you have to do it every day is something that is incredibly anchoring and empowering. And it's taught me that we all struggle with many different things in our lives, myself included. And there are days when I think, how on earth am I going to teach the daf tomorrow? How am I going to prepare, get my head focused on thinking about this? And how am I going to get up there and teach and be on? And yet somehow miraculously, every day I do it. And it teaches you that if you have an anchor in your life, then it anchors you. for those hours, I block everything out. And then it helps give you perspective on all those other things in your life, because sometimes we're so self-absorbed in what we're dealing with and what we're grappling with. And when you put that aside and you say, I'm focusing on something else, and you come back to it then with a better perspective. So I think many, many women have turned to me, particularly in the COVID pandemic, and said, I don't know where I would be without this anchor of Daf Yomi. It's keeping me alive. It's keeping me sane. It's keeping me connected. We have a Zoom every morning with 65 people from around the world, all different time zones. They become best friends with each other. We have WhatsApp groups of women communicating with each other in different locations about the Daf and talking. And it's created communities and it's created connection. And I think the real it's that anchor in everyone's life, and they're all connected, learning the same thing and discussing the same things.
Amazing. That's so inspiring to me as someone who builds my own life around Talmud Torah, but to hear that articulated so powerfully. And I wonder, like, in terms of having such an anchor, how do you think having the Talmud, daily Talmud learning as an anchor would be different or is distinctly important from if one had an anchor of Chumash or Chassidut or Musar? Like, how do you think the Daf is a unique anchor?
So first of all, I think any anchor is great. And anyone who wants to learn any subject, I think it's amazing. What I particularly love about the Talmud and what I think attracts people, first of all, it's very diverse. So you're learning the same kind of text every day, and every day it's different. And people who learn with me love that there's surprises in every daf, and all of a sudden you get a story, and then you get something mathematical, and then you get something about the stars and astrology, and then you get psychology, and every issue is architecture. Every issue is discussed in the Talmud. And if you want to talk about Chumash, so the way the Chumash is interpreted is in the Gemara. And you want to talk about Chassidut, the texts for Chassidut are all based in the Talmud. And one thing that I believe about the Talmud is, number one, it gives you a very solid understanding of, number one, how our halachic system works, which you won't necessarily get by learning Chumash or Chassidut. And if you're a halachic practicing Jew, to have an appreciation of what the process is and how is it that there's Ashkenazim and there's Faradim and they do different things, and where does that come from? Oh, one text said this and they had a different text that said that, or they interpreted it differently, and the way the system develops. And even if you're not a halachically practicing Jew, you have traditions, traditional Jewish things that you've been brought up with. And all the time I'm getting comments from people who say, I didn't know that was in the Talmud. Wow, I've been doing this for so many years. Who knew that came from the Talmud? And it encompasses so many different things. And the rabbis have so many interesting things to say about everything. And it's a fun book also, because it's discussions and arguments, and there's so much in it. And I think if you think about women in particular, because that's what we do at Hadran, which is promote the Talmud for women, I think you could somewhat categorize women into three categories. If we take women, let's say, who are new learners in the world of Talmud, I think they split into, from comments I've gotten from people, and there's women who think that Talmud, they've always wanted to learn. I'm going to read you some quotes, because one woman wrote me, I've always wanted to learn Talmud and never had an opening that felt safe until Hadran. And I think that that's very important, that women, whether it's safe or whether it's something that spoke to them, one of the issues I noticed when I started listening to different podcasts to see different styles is that the average woman who doesn't come from a background of Talmud, I came from a background, but women who hadn't, they're never going to be able to listen to the shiur, whether it's the topics he delves into, or the language he speaks in, yeshivish maybe, or words that people won't understand, or takes it for granted that you know certain things. So that's number one. There's women who say, also want to learn Talmud, but I thought I missed the boat. So, I didn't learn it in high school. I didn't learn it post-high school. I'm too old. Not going to happen for me anymore. And we're teaching people that, no, it's never too late. And then you have the more problematic category, which is all those women who say, oh, it's very nice that women should learn Talmud, but you know what? Talmud's just not for me. And for those women, I think many of them have been convinced that they should at least open it by seeing, and I have a great quote from someone who wrote to me that she's a big proponent of women's learning, but she always said, Talmud's not for me. And whether, she had a bad teacher in high school or whatever it might have been. And now she wrote to me after the Siyum, when she started learning, she said, it's enhancing my day, inspiring me Jewishly, and deepening my appreciation for the intellectual side of Judaism. It literally feels like I'm going back in time and listening to the conversations of a millennium ago, which I guess we are. And that really says it to me about what Talmud is all about. It's got all of those in it. and immersing yourself in it gives you all those elements. And I'm not saying you can't find it anywhere, but you definitely do find it in the Talmud.
Amazing. That's so amazing. So, and I'm sorry, each of these questions I know you could talk about for hours. I read a lot of the Jewish feminist literature, liberal feminists, Orthodox feminists, and those who don't use the language of feminism. They talk about inclusivity or access, whatever the case is. I appreciate it all. And I'm recently reading a debate or a dialogue between a liberal Jewish feminist, Professor Judith Plaskow, and an Orthodox feminist, Professor Tamar Ross, and seeing how differently they relate to texts. And I wonder, do you think that the Talmud, written almost entirely by men, do you think it's deeply impoverished by the lack of women's voices in the Talmud, or do you find there to be deep wisdom there in any case, nonetheless, with a gap?
So obviously, I think there's deep wisdom in there. Otherwise, I wouldn't be teaching it. And I think that's what our job is to do in this generation. Just like in all generations, the Talmud was studied differently throughout the generations. Everybody takes their life experience. And it's one of the things I love about teaching women, especially women who've never learned the Talmud before, because they look at it with a very fresh eye and using their life experience. Like I've had architects who have so much to say. We recently talked about the steps in the Talmud and how, I read it, okay, they go up an amma and in an amma. And my architects in the class said, what are you talking about? That's a very uncomfortable step. Nobody would build a step in that way. Now, whoever read that passage and started thinking about it in that way, right? Certainly not generations ago, people didn't think about that. And I think that the Talmud was meant as a book meant to be interpreted, right? It talks about lo b'shamayim hi, and it's given for interpretation. And I think that our role is always to interpret those texts with the tools that we're given now, whatever that may be, whether it's a woman's voice or a voice that was influenced by, whether it's a reading from a literary perspective, which it wasn't really studied in that way in the past, or at least not the way we call literary analysis of text. So I think that that's our role as women, particularly to read the text with our women eyes and with our perspective and add that to what's happening.
Yeah, amazing. Yeah, when I think about new social justice reads that we do sometimes in our Beit Midrash of how do we lift up the vulnerable, how do we combat oppression based upon some of these texts, it's exciting to think about that interpretive process. So just to get into a little bit more Torah specifically before we conclude, what is one Talmudic passage that animates your daily living? I'm sure you could think of countless, but is there one that you come back to on a daily basis that feels like in some ways central for you?
So whenever I teach this, I always say, this is my favorite line. You have to know some Gemara background to understand it, which is the time of the Gemara was the time period of the Amoraim, and they always brought in Tanaitic sources, which was the generation before them of the time of the Mishnah. And one of the things they did was memorize. They memorized all, they're called Braitot, things that didn't make it into the Mishnah, and their job was to memorize them. So once in a while, you see this scene in the Gemara where somebody comes in and they teach a Braita, and it was usually a student who was in charge of memorizing. And the teacher says to him, Puk Tane Livra, which literally means, you probably don't know what it means, most people. Puk means go out, and Tane means teach your Braita, Livra, outside. This has no place in the Beit Midrash. Now you might say, that's your favorite Talmudic passage. Well, okay, I'm going to tell you some really interesting things about this line. So first of all, what I love about it, and I used to teach in high school, and it was like for high school kids especially, it's very exciting. Why is it exciting? Because learning is not just monotone. It's all about this passion. Like, get out of my Beit Midrash. You can't speak those words in my Beit Midrash. So that's first of all, it shows how passionate they were about what they were studying. The second thing is, if you read it carefully, what does it say? It says, go teach this outside, which I'm going to explain in two ways. One is, go teach this outside means, I don't want you teaching this in my Beit Midrash, but I'm not telling you that there's no place for this at all. And that there's always room. You want to teach it, my little Beit Midrash, we don't teach that text. But if you want to teach it outside, go for it. I'm not telling you you're wrong. And you could have said, it's a mistake. You're wrong, right? There's so many ways people would say that, but no, go teach it outside. It doesn't belong here, but you can do it outside. The third is the outside part I want to focus on, which is, what does it mean outside? Wasn't the Torah learned in Batei Midrash And in fact, there's a famous Gemara that I also enjoy teaching, which is about, are we allowed to teach, can you teach Torah in the shuk, in the marketplace? Is that an appropriate place for Torah? And what he's saying is go teach that outside, meaning there's people outside who want to learn, and they're not maybe my kind of people, and they're not the people inside this Beit Midrash, but you can teach it to them. And that there's a world inside the Beit Midrash, but the Torah is not just in the Beit Midrash. And in Hadran, that's what we're really trying to show, which is we're going out of the Beit Midrash. We don't have a Beit Midrash. We don't have a closed space where people are dedicating X amount of time a day to sitting and learning, and maybe they don't have that time to spend. But you can learn Torah anywhere. You can listen on a podcast. You can watch on YouTube. You can access it on your way to work. We did a recent video of women and where they're learning, and people on treadmills and people. A woman recently did a Siyum HaShas at our last Siyum. She finished her 7.5 years and with Masechet Shkalim, and she talked about how she swam and listened to the daf. She had underwater earphones, and she would listen to the daf while she swam. And to think about that, you can learn anywhere you are, any way you want. There's so many different ways to learn, and that's what the diversity of the Talmud is all about.
So beautiful, so powerful. So last thing, you made a great case for Aliyah today. People should move to Renana and come learn at your dining room table. And if they're not going to do that right now or this week, how can they tap in? How can they learn with you and be a part of this?
Yes. So first of all, sadly, I no longer teach at my dining room table.
Okay.
COVID changed that
Oh,
all,
yes.
but for a very good reason. It was a very positive development, because now we have Zoom every day. One can join a Hebrew Zoom at 6:20 a.m. in Israel time. So you can calculate wherever you are. And at 7:10, there's a Hebrew Zoom every single day. So you can, number one, join our Zoom class. There's an amazing Zoom community. People have become friends with people all around the world. But if that's not for you, and most of our listeners, the thousands of listeners that listen, mostly do not come on the Zoom, but you can access it on a podcast on all the podcast channels that exist. You can find it on our website, hadran.org.il. We have not only my shiur, but as part of promoting other women scholars, we have other women scholars talking about daf related issues. So talking Talmud sits on our site, and we have Shuli Mishkin, who does something about history on the daf. And in Hebrew, we have a bunch of other series of vlogs and shiurim. And you can come to the site and learn all different kinds of things. You can learn by Masechet. You don't have to learn Daf Yomi. You can choose, I want to learn Masechet Shabbat. I want to learn Masechet Brachot. I'll start and I'll do it at my own pace. There's so many different ways that you can learn. As I mentioned, we had a skills class, so you can learn basic Gemara skills. So all that is at hadran.org.il. There's also a subscribe page, which shows you all the different ways you can subscribe for the podcast and many different ways you can learn. You can always reach out to us.
Amazing. Thank you so much, friends. We hope you'll plug in. Thank you so much, Rabbanit Michelle Cohen Farber, and wishing you so much continued success.
Thanks so much for having me.